Okay, hi, good evening. Welcome to New Canaan Library, everyone. Those of you who've been here before know the drill. Please take a moment to silence your cell phones. And everyone, just note the exits from this room to your right and left, right out onto the street, or back through the concourse, same way you entered. Now, this is a very special America 250 event for us because it not only looks back at the founding and evolution of a very important American institution, it also shows how that institution is still thriving today with its scientifically driven, future-forward approach. I'm talking about the New York Botanical Garden, located in the Bronx and open to the public since 1896. This is a place that so many of us love and that everyone should visit. How many of you have been there? Just show of hands. So like almost everyone. Yeah, any time of the year, truly. It preserves landscape designs of the past, like the Peggy Rockefeller Rose Garden, also spaces that highlight work by early 20th century landscape designers such as Beatrix, Farrand, and Marian Coffin. And in the last 20 years, it has also restored around 150 acres of landscape while completely changing its gardening practices. NYBG's new approach seeks to balance horticultural beauty with environmental responsibility, and today we have Todd Forrest with us here to explain why and how it's doing this. Forrest is Arthur Ross Vice President for Horticulture and Living Collections at NYBG, and he will discuss the garden's role as a National Historic Landmark and a model of how thoughtful design and management of gardens might be our most effective approach to repairing our damage to the natural world. And now please help me welcome Todd Forrest.
Thanks, Vicki, and hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out on this really beautiful evening. I feel a little badly that I've drugged you away from your normal evening walk locations, so I'll do the best that I can to have a virtual walk through the New York Botanical Garden. First of all, it's amazing. It's a great honor to be in this beautiful room. And I live in Ridgefield, which is a few towns over, and I have complicated feelings about New Canaan that are born of children's sports. So I'll try to forget those and view you all as friends and not as rivals. So as Mickey said, this talk tonight is kind of included in the America 250 program. So I'm going to start off by focusing a lot on the garden's history, which is fascinating, and end with a little bit about the direction that we're going in, specifically with the way that we care for our remarkable 250-acre National Historic Landmark in the Bronx. So here goes. I usually ask the question, how many people have been to the garden? But Mickey asked it, and it's lovely to see that this is a group of people with just fabulous taste and spare time. It's a good combination. Okay, so I am going to start going. So I would imagine that most of you who have been to the New York Botanical Garden have, say, visited the garden in April to see what is, I think, the time of greatest bounty across our 250 acres, a time of flowering of our extraordinary cherry collections and daffodils and the rock garden, just a sequence of huge spectacle that unfold across the landscape as spring itself unfolds, including this. This is a giant old cherry planted outside of the rock garden. It's what we call the Ito-Hegan cherry. And it probably was planted in the early 1930s when the rock garden itself was built. And it is an absolute sight to behold for about 3 days in April. And it's a different 3 days every April. So my advice to all of you is to come to NYBG every day in April and then to look to see if this tree is at peak. Or you might have come for one of our many exhibitions. This is Flower Power, the exhibition that is running now, which is a celebration of flowers as symbols of peace and love. A wonderful exploration of the late 60s floral iconography that includes amazing sculptures, of course, extensive plantings, but also in our library gallery, really great material from the 1960s, original dresses. There's one that I want to get for my wife, so if it disappears, you know where it went. Or maybe that you've come with your families to the Edible Academy or the Everett Children's Adventure Garden. We have amazing programs at NYBG for garden lovers of all ages, and we continuously work on these programs to make them more exciting and more relevant and more engaging for modern audiences, for modern young audiences. And it's really exciting. It energizes the space to have so many young people wandering about and getting their hands dirty. But what I'll talk about today is the way the landscape itself has evolved over time. This is a picture of the Native Plant Garden, which is one of the many landscapes that we've worked on over the past 25 years. And oh, by the way, I've been at NYBG for 28 years. I've been head of horticulture since 2004, so I think that's 22 years. So it really is, it's a huge part of who I am as a person, the place, and I have extreme pride of place. I'm very house proud, so I really will sound a lot like a cheerleader for the place, because there is no place in the world that I find that balances history, natural beauty, thoughtful garden design, and the capacity to change quite as well as NYBG does. So, let's go back to the beginning. The garden was founded by an act of the state legislature of New York, in 1891, to pursue a three-part mission of botanical science, education, and horticulture. And it was founded by a dynamic husband and wife duo, Nathaniel Britton, shown here on the left, as you look at it, who was a great botanist and geologist and kind of overall naturalist, and his wife Elizabeth Britton, who frankly has never gotten the credit that is due to her. She really was the co-founder of the institution. She was herself a great scientist. She was a biologist, a moss expert, and she was also an early advocate for the preservation of native wildflowers based on things that she observed happening in the garden's landscape that we'll touch on a little bit in the future. And the garden was actually the third of the great cultural institutions created in New York City. The first was the American Museum of Natural History, founded in 1869. The next was the Met in 1870, then the NYBG in 1891. So as an institution, it was created as part of this amazing era in New York's history, funded really primarily by Gilded Age tycoons, of creating institutions for the betterment of the whole population. And we're very proud as an institution to be part of that remarkable legacy in New York. And really in America, there are a few places in the world that have had such extraordinary civic investment, again, in cultural institutions and other places that are meant really to make the lives better for their citizens, such as Central Park. Central Park is to this day really arguably the most important urban green space in the world. It was designed and created and built for people to escape the squalor of the surrounding city. You all know this story, designed by Frederick Earl Olmsted, on 800 or so acres in the center of the expanding city. And it is thought to be one of the great, if not the greatest examples of urban landscape architecture in the world. And any student of landscape architecture will go to Central Park at some time and just revel in the extraordinary kind of intentional designed beauty of the place. But what Central Park did is it made New Yorkers realize that they needed as much green space in their city as possible. The city was growing like crazy in the late 19th century, and so a pretty remarkable thing happened that NYBG is a part of. In the 1884, the New Parks Act was passed. That set aside 3,500 acres of land in the Bronx, which only half of which was part of New York City in 1884. The other half was annexed to the city in 1895. And that huge amount of parkland was joined together, if you guys can see in this picture, by a series of parkways, the Mosholu Parkway and the Pelham Parkway. So it joins Van Cortlandt Park in the north, all the way to Pelham Bay Park on the edge of Long Island Sound. This is a remarkable legacy in New York City. And again, it was inspired directly by the creation of Central Park. So this creation of urban green spaces and this creation of urban cultural institutions were very much involved in the creation of NYBG as we know it as an institution. And so in 1895, 4 years after the garden was incorporated by an act of the state legislature, Nathaniel Britton and the scientific committee was given the opportunity to choose part of what was this 3,500 acres of parkland as the home for the garden. So why the 4-year delay? Written into that act of incorporation in 1891 was the requirement that the institution raise $250,000 to support the scientific and educational program of the institution. And once the garden did that, they would be granted 250 acres of parkland in the Bronx to use as their home. So it took them 4 years to raise that money. That's the equivalent of $9 million in modern money. So fundraising was the very first institutional act, and it continues to this very day. It's very expensive to run the New York Botanical Garden, and we really depend on the generosity of people to keep going. And increasingly, visitors who come to the garden to experience its beauty and its diverse programs. So this is the landscape that Britain chose. It was one of 3 locations. The current location of Van Cortlandt Park. Have you all been to Van Cortlandt Park? Lovely, extraordinary, huge park. And the current location of the Bronx Zoo, which is just south of NYBG in Bronx Park. And Britain and the scientific community chose our site primarily because at its heart was a 50-acre old-growth forest called the Hemlock Grove, through which ran the Bronx River, New York City's only freshwater river. They chose it because of its natural qualities. And around that core of nature, that heart of nature in the middle of the landscape, were a series of old farm fields and pastures, as you can see here, shaded by ancient trees that had escaped the axe. This was different than the European gardens, including Kew, that were the inspiration for the institution. Most European gardens were built within the urban grid, were very highly designed, and the only nature they had was the plants that grew in them. Britain had extraordinary foresight when he understood that having actual nature at that time at the edge of the expanding city, of course now it's in the middle of this huge metropolitan area, would set NYBG apart from all of the other botanical gardens in the world. And we are all the beneficiaries of that amazing decision today. So I'm more than a little competitive, as you could tell by my remark about New Canaan, the Rams, boo. So I do love and respect Central Park, and there have been more than one time over my long career at NYBG that I've had to listen to someone wax on about what an extraordinary work of art Central Park is because of the incredible design of Frederick Law Olmsted, and all of that is true. And then I came across this quote from Charles Sprague Sargent, who was the founding director of Harvard's Arnold Arboretum. And I will read it because I just get so much joy out of reading it. It was actually an editorial in Garden and Forest, which is a publication that Sargent created and edited for about 20 years, which is an amazing late 19th century, early 20th century article. It's then the difference between horticulture and forestry and botany and conservation, they weren't as stark as they are today. They were all kind of part of living with nature in an enlightened and informed way. So what he wrote in an editorial, he had a little bit of a problem with the initial design of the garden. And instead of sort of dealing with it kind of directly, he griped about it. He lobbed bombs from the sideline. And what he wrote was, "No city in the world possesses more beautiful scenery or a park area more thoroughly characteristic of what is most delightful in the landscape of the part of the world in which it is situated than does New York and Bronx Park. The city spent money like water to create some charming natural scenery in what is now Central Park by blasting out ridges of rock, filling in the spaces of the soil, and turning this desert of stone into tree-flecked meadowland. Now that it has come into some possession of some scenery far more beautiful and ready-made, it would be folly to destroy it. Far more beautiful and ready-made." And you say, oh, maybe that was an overstatement. But there is documentary evidence from the late 19th century that proves the point that NYBG's choice of site was brilliant. That is the site, a painting of the site of Central Park before construction of the park. Yeah, it was, as you all know, the story was there were people living there. It was kind of a dump. It was just a dump at the edge of the city. And again, more proof that Frederick Olmsted was a genius because you don't get any sense of this. But Central Park is pure artifice. This is the before picture of the site that was to become the New York Botanical Garden. You know, extraordinary nature at the edge of the expanding city. This is the Hemlock Grove and the Bronx River, right now, right in the very middle of the New York Botanical Garden. So that decision to build a very formal European-inspired botanical garden around the heart of nature that lies at the center of the landscape, again, was a little bit crazy. It's hard to make a garden on rocks and in forests. They're kind of, these things are in conflict with one another at times. But it turned out to be brilliant beyond description. So this is the original plan, which was again created in 1896. And you can see at the heart, the forest, the shape of the garden is different. Those of you who know the garden right now, and that's a long story. The garden was 250 acres when it was founded. In 1915, it grew to 400 acres. In 1937, it was reduced in size again back to 250 acres, except for it wasn't the same 250 acres that was founded. The only thing that was really preserved were the areas, the forest itself and the river, and then areas a little bit to the east and the west. The whole northern part of the garden was taken away, and much of the eastern part of the garden was taken away. So at the heart was the forest and river, and then around it were a series of systematically designed plant collections that were generally installed and designed in a way that people, just on a walk through the landscape, would be going on a tour of evolutionary history of plants in the space. And then again, the design decisions that were made were to not remove a single tree, a single healthy tree. So all the roads were aligned so they avoided trees, as you can see in this picture on the left. And then the plantings themselves outside of the forest were also designed in a very naturalistic way. So nature was very much forefront in the choice of site, and nature was very much forefront in the way that the site was designed and built over time. And so by 1921, you had this amazing pastiche of old-growth forest, ancient native shade trees outside that forest, and of course the buildings and collections that were created as part of the garden. Pretty magical. And 35 years after its founding, that decision to preserve this little piece of nature in the middle of the city is that much more brilliant. It really feels like an island, an emerald island in the middle of a gray sea. So what I'll do now is go through some of the characteristic spaces of the garden, kind of then and now. So here's the river and forest as they were found in 1896, pretty magical. And there's the river and forest as they are today. Again, the thing that distinguishes NYBG from all other botanical gardens in cities around the world is the presence of this true nature. This is one of the early systematic collections. This was called the Pinetum. It is now called the Arthur Ross Conifer Arboretum. You can see the little baby pine trees, but if you look around them, you'll see these amazing oaks and maples and elms and sweet gums that were also preserved, and the trees are planted amongst them. What is wonderful and rewarding every day about working in a place like NYBG is that it is a time machine. Because every day I see the results of those decisions that were made by my predecessors either 50 years ago or 130 years ago. And there's the Pinetum today. These are the Tenyosha pines, quite magical. Some things change, some things don't change. This is our museum building and the Hafe tulip tree LA, which was planted in 1903. You can see the giant tulip tree on the left-hand side. That's what we call the mother tree. It was a tree that was already maybe 150 years old when the garden was founded. And you can see all the little baby tulip trees on either side. They were planted in 1903 originally. This was a few years after they were planted. Well, how many of you saw the tulip tree LA in its prime with the big old tulip trees lining the drives up to the, well, a few years ago, we had to replant it. So it now in 2026 looks a lot the way that it did in 1903. And that's actually one of the hardest things to do, the hardest things to kind of come to grips with as a steward of a historic landscape is when to make decisions to make important changes. Those trees, the trees that had been planted, had sort of reached the end of their functional lifespan. But what was wonderful, the mother tree, as you can see in the picture, is still there, still has a lot of life left in her. And that's a subject for a whole nother presentation, which maybe one day I will make. But it was an interesting process to go through to remove these historic trees and replant them. There's the conservatory under construction, and of course the conservatory today, quite magical. The Deciduous Arboretum, which is again part of the systematic plantings laid out in the 1890s and 1906, and the Burke Oaks, which we just restored in 2022 today. Again, the combination of newly planted trees and these ancient native trees really kind of define the character and quality of the landscape. The Peggy Rockefeller Rose Garden, as it was under construction in 1916, as you can see in the background, more amazing native trees preserved, in this very kind of unpromising little triangle of mud, and of course the Peggy Rockefeller Rose Garden today. Time in gardens, if you have good gardening, is one of the most wonderful things. Daffodil Hill in 1926, planted because as the landscape grew to 400 acres, there was a lot of found land. At the same time, there was a bit of a hue and cry for having more beauty for beauty's sake across the landscape. We had a wonderful woman named Mrs. Peckham, who was the volunteer curator of the Narcissus and Iris collections, and she had the brilliant idea to plant 130,000 daffodil bulbs in this new southwestern corner of the garden. And this was a few years, 1924 is when they started. And they did that for a few years, and then they completely stopped planting daffodils for nearly 100 years. And in 2015, we kind of picked up where she left off. Fortunately, many of the daffodils that had been planted in the 1920s survived with benign neglect, and we've been in the process of adding 1 million new daffodils since 2015. And again, Daffodil Hill on roughly April 22nd is not to be missed. It's one of the few parts of the garden that I can confidently predict within a few days what peak will be, although this year was a little bit aggravating because we had a weird winter. Pretty amazing. All right. The Rock Garden, under construction in 1932, it was conceived and created by T.H. Everett, who was the legendary head of horticulture, my predecessor. He worked at the garden from 1932 until about 1966. He was an English gardener trained at Kew. He came over to the U.S. to work at the great estate of Samuel Untermeyer, which is now the Untermeyer Garden in Yonkers. And the garden kind of wooed him away, and he became the head of horticulture, but there was one condition for him to move to NYBG, and it was that he could make a traditional alpine garden, a rockery, which he did starting in 1932. You can see using horsepower, quite literally, to build the cascade. And again, that's the cascade, more or less now. This is a magical, multi-season, very layered garden. It's the most sophisticated garden at NYBG, without question. And it really takes advantage of the nature of the site, the natural bedrock across the site, and again, the forested areas on either side. It feels like an oasis in the middle of the garden. The ladies' border, which really was our first kind of mixed border, is designed by Ellen Shipman, the great American landscape architect. Again, the design of this garden had been spurred on by the Women's Auxiliary, which is why it's called the ladies' border. At that time, and for quite a while, the garden's board was entirely male. They were very self-satisfied, and they were very serious men. And in 1914, they created the Women's Auxiliary, and the women sort of just knocked some sense into these stodgy old men who had run the garden for a long time. They just said, we do love the nature and we love the collections, they're wonderful, but there's this whole movement of ornamental gardening that's happening around the world. And I think a great botanical garden in one of the great cities of the world should actually reflect that movement. So the ladies' border, which is built and designed adjacent to the conservatory, was our first kind of amenity garden, just garden for the sake of beauty and not for collections or research or education. So there it is when it was created, and then it was reconceived in the early 2000s by Lyndon Miller to feature plants not normally considered hardy in New York City. And I made the unfortunate reference, I called it our global warming garden in the early 2000s, which was a little bit intemperate because we were trying things like camellia and crepe myrtle and things that just weren't considered hardy in New York City, mostly because it's a microclimate protected by the conservatory. And then I've had to explain that for more than 20 years. But it's an amazing place, and now most of the plants that we plant in the ladies' border actually do perfectly well in other places around the garden, maybe because of climate change, who knows. The Native Plant Garden, again formed in honor of Elizabeth Britton, who not only was a great moss expert, and not only was she someone who really advocated for native plants, she was a co-founder of the Wildflower Society of America, which as far as I can tell was, if not the first, among the first plant conservation organizations in the world, because she saw the native wildflowers in the forest slowly disappearing because of the tragedy of commons. People would come in and they'd pick a trillium, they'd pick a bloodroot, and over time, you get enough people doing that, the wildflowers are disappearing. So after she died in the late 1920s, they set aside a little part of the garden of NYBG that had been undeveloped and called it it was basically a bird and wildflower preserve in her honor. That became the Native Plant Garden. It became more and more complicated, but kind of less and less beautiful over time. So there was a garden in 2009. And there's the garden today after we worked with Uma van Sweden to create this garden in 2013. The idea here was to wrest native plants from the realm of the Birkenstock-wearing people and give them to people who love beautiful gardens. The idea, you don't want to have to guilt people into using native plants in their gardens. You should inspire people to use native plants in their gardens. The Montgomery conifers, originally laid out in 1949, restored in 2004. It's now the Bennett's and Armel conifers, extraordinary cultivars of native trees, but also this is laid out by Marian Coffin. Just quite beautiful the way that it sets into the natural landscape. The azalea garden, originally conceived in the 1980s, where they just threw some azaleas beneath some of the huge tulip trees and sweet gums and elms in our landscape, and then again designed with Uma van Sweden to become more accessible and more modern and more relevant. The perennial garden, originally laid out as one of the few kind of ornamental plantings early in the garden's history, redesigned by Lyndon Miller starting in the late 1980s. And in front of the conservatory, it really is magical 12 months a year. The Byrne family lilac collection, I don't have any before pictures because it was so boring. And it restored in 2016 and is now, you can smell it from New Canaan when the lilacs are in flower, and it would draw you there. It is really quite remarkable. Lilacs are tricky because they're plants that really like a colder climate. So if you want lilacs, you go to Rochester. So we've been playing around with lilac varieties that can deal with the heat and humidity of New York, as you can see, with great success. So it's been a lot of fun to build that. The Matalich Peony collection expanded in 2016. The Steinhardt maples, which was, the maple collection was relocated when the garden shrunk in size in 1937. And then we added a lot of Japanese maple cultivars, and it really is beautiful in the fall. But the insider secret about the maple collection is that it really is a spring garden. As you can see, as the new foliage emerges across all these hundreds of different cultivars, it almost feels like it's in full flower. It is amazing to see in the spring. All right, so that's the sort of setting up the remainder. So here we have, and I kind of set it up that way to make it seem like I'm not a wild-eyed tree-hugging lunatic. I'm somebody, I mean, I am, but professionally, I'm somebody who cares a lot about garden design, who cares a lot about tradition, and I've stayed at NYBG for long enough that I've actually become part of that tradition. I believe that gardens and gardening are most successful when they speak to the heart of the gardener. And I think that a lot of what has been said and is being said about sustainability in gardens is meant to rip the joy out of gardening from people who garden. For example, people would feel guilty maybe about planting daffodils or lilacs, neither of which are native. I really don't think that that's a productive way to go about this. I really do believe that gardeners will save the earth because we've done so much damage to the earth that we have to do work to fix it. Just stepping back and leaving things alone will not be enough. So actually, the eye and the brain and the hand of a great gardener is what the earth will need over time. And so we're doing that at NYBG to the best that we can. We recognize that some gardening traditions are damaging, but most gardening traditions hold within them the possibility of healing and rebirth, and all while engaging people with the beauty of plants. So this is a garden in Ridgefield, and this is a very beautifully maintained, actually exquisitely maintained traditional garden in Ridgefield. And it's great. And I really want to knock on this person's door. I live in Ridgefield, I walk by all the time, and I take pictures of the man's house. And I'm pretty sure it's a man who does most of this decision making. Because I'm so impressed by just the level of quality. But I think we can do better. And this is something that if we can do it at scale, we can make a real difference. And gardens and lawn are a huge part of the American landscape. All told, about 40 million acres, to which are applied 20 million tons of fertilizer, 80 million pounds of pesticides, and more than 3 trillion gallons of water. So collectively, at scale, gardens make a huge difference environmentally. So if we change the way that we do our gardens, we can make a huge difference environmentally. Many of you recognize some of these products. You could see them in the shelf in your local hardware store. Most people, or some people, apply them without ever reading the label. So if I can change anybody's idea about the world in this room, it would be please read the label of anything that you apply to your garden and understand what it is that you're applying. And then also understand what it is that you're planting. Invasive species are a real problem in natural areas. We know this from firsthand experience in the forest in the middle of the garden. And about 87% of the invasive species that are plaguing our natural areas were introduced through gardens, right? So we can't pretend that gardens aren't doing some harm to the environment, but we also know that the act of gardening can really do a lot to restore the environment. One way that we look at this is through the idea of gardens and watersheds. So your garden, every garden is in a watershed. It's connected to a body of water, which is connected to a larger body of water, and onward down to the ocean. And understanding that your garden is connected more broadly to nature is a really important thing to reset your frame of mind as you garden. You're not just gardening in your own backyard. You're gardening in a watershed. You're gardening in an ecosystem. And this was a study that was done in Minneapolis, and these are looking at a watershed level, the source of a variety of pollutants. And if you look at nitrogen and phosphorus, which lead to eutrophication of water bodies, a lot of those come from residential fertilizer. That's the green bar in the nitrogen category. Oddly, a lot of the phosphorus pollution comes from pet waste. It means that by applying things in your own garden, you are actually impacting the larger environment. Awareness of that allows you to change your garden's relationship with the larger earth. We all live in the Long Island Sound watershed in New Canaan. So what we put in our gardens in New Canaan and in Ridgefield end up in the Long Island Sound. The Long Island Sound has been really struggling with hypoxia, which is low oxygen levels. There was a huge lobster die-off about 15 years ago that could be directly attributed to a combination of lawn fertilizers and bad septic systems and bad sewage treatment plants. And at NYBG, of course, we're in a watershed. We have the Bronx River, which I've talked about, that runs 24 miles from the Kensico Reservoir in Westchester into the East River. It is a tributary of Long Island Sound. So what we do there has an impact, but also what other people do in the watershed has an impact on NYBG. And we experience that firsthand. You can see after a big rainstorm, we get all the wonderful cups and junk that people throw out their car window on the Bronx River Parkway. So you have that. These are called floatables. We also have had periods of low dissolved oxygen. It's a fish that's swimming with its little mouth out of the water because it can't get enough oxygen from the water itself. That's mostly because of bad sewage infrastructure to our north. Then, of course, there are somewhat regular spills within the watershed. All of these are impacting NYBG. So from our perspective, we could be perfect with the way that we take care of our own landscape, but if the people to our north and other aspects of the watershed are not, we will never be perfect because the garden will never be purely healthy. So what can we as gardeners do? First and foremost, we should follow the principle of do no harm. And I'll use an example. So we have about 70 acres of lawns at NYBG. This is part of the original late 19th century greensward design. Lawns are very practical. If you want to go look at a magnolia flower in our magnolia collection, you wouldn't want to tramp through a perennial garden to get there. We wouldn't want you to. They're a wonderful neutral setting for our trees and gardens. And they're actually the lowest input from a labor perspective of anything we do at NYBG other than care for the forest. Again, we have about 70 acres of them across our 250 acres. Using traditional lawn care methods, this is what we were getting. This is the main lawns in front of the library building. This is our front lawn. And we would just put fertilizers and we would water them and we would treat fungal diseases and insects and whatever. And we were just chasing it, not getting anywhere. A close-up, the soil was dust. There was literally no life in the soil because we had been applying these traditional methods for so long. And just by taking a soil-based approach, just by taking an informed ecological-based approach to taking care of our lawns, these are those same lawns today. The lawns themselves are healthier because the soil is healthier, and the soil is healthier because we are managing the soil, and the lawns are actually a wonderful reflection of that improved soil health. So we would be in no position to criticize those of you who have lawns, and I wouldn't want to do so. Another important change for us is that we've been a little bit looser with what we allow to grow on our lawns. Part of the reason why we had that dust is because we were trying to get rid of things like clover, which is asinine. Clover is your friend because it's a nitrogen fixer. It has a relationship with nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So it actually reduces the need for fertilizer in your lawn, and it has the added benefit of supporting pollinators. And so our lawns are way shaggier, way more biodiverse now than they were 15 years ago, but way healthier. And again, they're not doing any harm. And in fact, it turns out that they're doing a little bit of good. The Peggy Rockefeller Rose Garden. When I became head of horticulture, again, this garden was on a drip. It was on a chemical drip. It was fungicides weekly, it was insecticides regularly, it was being watered, and it was in terrible shape. It looked great for about 5 minutes, and the rest of the time it was just a source of heartbreak. By changing our thought process, we started to focus on roses that had been bred for innate, genetically driven resistance to pathogens, particularly black spot, which is the great enemy of roses in our climate. And it turns out that in France and in Germany, where it's illegal to apply chemicals to ornamental plants, the rose breeders said, instead of just saying, forget it, we're just going to give up, decided to breed roses that were inherently resistant to black spot. And that inspired a kind of movement to use traditional rose breeding approaches to bring roses to the market that themselves are great. And the rose garden now, it's not organic. We spot spray as necessary from time to time, but the rose garden is far healthier and far more beautiful than it has been in decades, again, because we're taking the principle of doing no harm. We still have this very traditional early 20th century rose garden. We're dealing with weeds in novel ways. In 2020, we were able to bring a foaming unit. This is basically just applying hot water with soap suds. It's a proprietary soap suds that are very expensive, but still, it's just soap suds. And that's what we use to treat weeds in the hardscape, right? You all see the little weeds that you would hit with Roundup or whatever. And we said, well, again, they can't use those chemicals in Europe, so they developed this technology in Europe, and we brought one over. And we use this in most cases instead of herbicides. And even in our meadow, and in another lecture I can talk about all the trials and tribulations with our meadow is overrun by mugwort. So we have been using steam to actually treat mugwort. So we cut the meadow way back, or section by section. We steam the ground and we replant. And if you grow a meadow in our climate, weeds will come, I promise you. Any patch of land in our part of the world over time wants to be a forest. So meadows are beautiful and they're interesting and they support lots of pollinators, but they take constant work. Don't fool yourself into thinking that if you set a meadow, all you have to do is mow it occasionally, it'll be fine. If you want to have that biodiversity and support biodiversity, you have to garden that meadow incredibly intensively over time. The steaming unit has been extraordinary because it's allowed us to reset the meadow, and we're pretty sure we'll have to do this every 10 to 15 years, which is fine because we love having the meadow and it's quite beautiful. And we don't do it all at once, we do it in segments, and it's been very successful. We also use a collection of mostly organic products to promote plant health throughout the garden. So again, to reduce the fertilizers and the pesticides and the fungicides, we are continuously experimenting with natural materials to try to promote plants' internal capacity to defend themselves against pests with great success. Again, part of this is also allowing pests to persist, to lower your thresholds, to not worry, or to raise your thresholds, depending on your perspective, to not worry so much about things, that you don't need perfection all the time. You want to work towards a healthy, resilient, vibrant space. Preserving our mature trees, we have about 30,000 trees across the garden, including those in the forest, and trees themselves are just engines of biodiversity and engines of sustainable living. So we spend a lot of time, effort, and energy taking care of our trees, and we always have. This is Pascal Perron, who is a pathologist and tree expert at the garden for about 30 years in the middle of the 20th century, and he started this tradition of mature tree care, which continues today. And we have 3 climber pruners who are just scrambling all the time to take care of our great trees. And of course, we have new emerging pests all the time. You guys, I'm sure, have all heard of beech leaf disease and emerald ash borer. You might not have heard of pine and graver beetle or oak wilt, but if you haven't, you will soon. And so we're doing this work caring for our trees in a very hostile environment that's caused by environmental change. And we're doing it with great success. We're also, of course, planting new trees. And maybe the most important thing I've done over my career is have overseen the planting of literally too many trees to count. Because we want the garden in 100 years to be as beautiful as the garden was 100 years ago and as it is today. So remember that house that I showed you in Ridgefield, the white one that's all very kind of anal but impressive? This is literally its next door neighbor. And it's the most beautiful thing. I was just thinking today is I'll go across the street and take a picture of them both. And you can see, you can't read the signs, but it's like, nature's backyard, and, it's like leave your leaves in their lawn. And I will give them, 95 points and this is the only house on Main Street in Ridgefield that looks like this. You cannot miss it. And good for them. It's kind of gutsy to do this. And my only slight complaint is that, do you have to have so many plastic signs being so self-congratulatory on your lawn? Probably not, but they are trying to sort of get the message across. And I don't know if they're doing this as a way of thumbing their nose at their next door neighbor, which is interesting to me. But they are doing it. And the point is that they're in this little, maybe it's an acre and a half. They believe they've sort of consumed the Kool-Aid. They believe that by changing the way they care for their garden, that they are going to make their little corner of the world healthier, more resilient, more biodiverse. And we can all do that. So if you want to, follow the principles of gardening with nature, it's pretty simple. The first is to try to do no harm and be aware that your garden is part of a larger system. And then start to think that, wow, I have the skills to actually heal the earth. And where I'm going to do that is in the little piece of land that I can control. And then if you do it and your neighbor does it and their neighbor does it and so on and so forth, all of a sudden that 40 million acres, that real land across the US will become something that instead of causing problems will be something that will be creating solutions. And then of course, start in your own garden, but volunteer in local and regional nature centers and put your gardening skills to good use more broadly. So that I think is it. That is it. Whew. Right under the wire.
Wonderful, Todd. Thank you so much. We're going to turn to Q&A right now. We have a few moments. If you just raise your hand, we'll come to you with the mic. Okay.
Thank you. Great presentation. Really
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Talk a little bit about invasives. I've been hearing a lot of commentary around Norway maples.
Yes.
And there are a lot in this area, apparently.
Yeah, there are. So it's a rogues gallery of plants, and as I said, about 87% of them were introduced for ornamental purposes. And Norway maple, which is a very beautiful shade tree, it's relatively easy to grow for nurseries and was very, very widely planted. The challenge with Norway maple is that it's allelopathic, which means that it produces chemicals out of its roots that impair the growth of other plants. And it has no natural predators in our environment. So when it gets established in natural areas and forests, it really not only kind of takes over its own space, but it prevents other things from growing. And we have a handful of Norway maples in our living collections. Our approach to, because we've been growing plants since the late 19th century, well before the notion of invasive species was around, we're not cutting them all down immediately. We are just, for many things, we're just not going to replace them when they go away naturally. But we do remove invasives from the forest itself. Weirdly, we don't have a lot of Norway maple in our forest because our forest is an old-growth forest, which has a different soil profile and soil chemistry. So all of the most regular invasives that we have around here, barberry, burning bush, Norway maple, don't really exist in our forest, even though we've been growing them at NYBG since the 1890s.
Okay. Over here.
It's another invasive question.
Excellent. I love those.
Would you consider Queen Anne's lace to be invasive, or would you consider it to be indigenous?
It's definitely not indigenous. I don't think it's invasive. So by definition, an invasive plant is a species from another place that has become established, that reproduces and does harm, either ecological or economic harm. And Queen Anne's lace is gorgeous along roadsides, as well as chicory. And funny story is we had a project in a part of the garden that's actually where we do our composting. And it was a project, like always, we never had quite enough money to do all the work we wanted to do, and we were not going to get any gardeners to grow there, to do the work there. So I had to come up with an idea that would be low cost to build and no cost to maintain. Anyway, so what I was inspired by were the roadsides. Driving around here in the summer, and I saw chicory and Queen Anne's lace, and I said, if I can end up with that, these are, along the Merritt Parkway, it's mown maybe twice or three times a year, and it's kind of beautiful, like all the time. So I was like, please let it be chicory and Queen Anne's lace, please. It's not. It's like burdock and mugwort, and it's not. It has none of the charm of the Merritt Parkway. So Queen Anne's lace is not indigenous or native, but also not problematic. Oh, follow up.
Okay,
Yeah.
somebody here. Oh, can I come back to you because there's
Yeah.
two people here.
Oh, hi. I wondered about the lawn that you showed that changed so dramatically.
Yeah.
And all you mentioned in that change was it got shaggy with clover. Was there anything else that helped it change?
So this picture right here, see those little holes in the soil? That's somebody going through with an auger to break up the soil compaction to add oxygen, and we backfilled that with compost that we make in our own system, and that's it. Augered it, added compost, and we stopped spraying it relentlessly. We changed our mowing regimes a little bit. No, we have tons of weeds in that lawn. Yeah. And but this is literally a picture I took last week. I mean, which is kind of fun. No. I put like a fuzzy focus so the leaves don't jump off. It's all very intentional. But this is no. I mean, we mow it. This is our like high intensity lawn. This is a lawn that we actually do kind of care that looks at least not embarrassing. But it's I really do think that it's not that it's no care, it's just that it's not overwrought. There's a lot of gardening tradition is overwrought. It's just too much. It's too much for anybody, and you can do it because you're obsessed in your own garden, but you're not going to be in your own garden forever. Your kids are going to get it, or you're going to sell it. You're going to move to, God forbid, Arizona or Florida, and then somebody else is going to do something, right? So just take a deep breath, and have a little bit of fun with it.
And you can get your soil tested, I think, for free, right? In Connecticut, the Yukon Ag Station. I think you can go online.
For free. Yeah, but Yukon is great. It's amazing.
It's great, or really low cost.
It's a very, very low cost, and it's very useful. And that could be a whole other lecture is soil tests.
So we have the follow-up back there?
Yeah.
Yeah, I probably didn't ask it the right way. So in a garden that's purposely planted with hydrangea and rhododendrons and catnip,
Yeah.
and you have this Queen Anne's lace coming up through the middle of all of it,
Yeah.
does that make it invasive?
It makes it a weed.
And what do you do about it?
That sounds beautiful to me. better Queen Anne's lace than mugwort.
Okay.
And so,
Do we have another
yeah,
one?
I mean,
We
again,
have
the
one
difference
back
between
here.
an invasive species, which does ecological harm, and a weed. A weed is a plant. There are two definitions. It's a weed. The traditional definition is a plant in a place where you, as the gardener, feel it does not belong. The other definition is a weed is a plant whose virtues you have not yet discovered.
I love it. We have one over here.
Yeah. Okay.
Hi, Todd. I just wanted to ask, I had heard in another lecture the newest invasives, and one of them that I did hear was Coosa dogwood.
Yeah.
And there were 3 others, but maybe you want to talk about that too, because there's a lot of Coosa dogwoods and they're all blooming right now.
There are a lot of Coosa dogwoods at NYBG. Yeah, so we have this is an extremely important subject for us because we have an old growth forest that is, again, it's a whole nother topic for another lecture. It was called the hemlock grove. The hemlocks were in trouble in the early 1900s. The hemlocks have more or less gone, but it still has century-old oaks and tulip trees and sweet gums, and it is invaded primarily by a suite of plants that we planted in the garden around it, right? We did. No one did it intentionally. Kousa dogwood is not one of them, just like barberry is not one of them, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of things that are emerging as invasives. Kousa dogwood, Japanese maples, I just showed you a picture of extraordinary Japanese maples. Our strategy about this is we are going to continue to observe and see how these things unfold in our landscape, but communicate to people that these have become invasive in other parts of the world, and to advocate that to give people alternatives to Kousa dogwood and Japanese maple and other kind of things that are emerging as invasives, without making people feel like they have to go cut down their Kousa dogwoods and Japanese maples right now. If we can slowly change, it's taken decades or centuries really for some of these problems to emerge. We're not going to solve them overnight. And so I think, and this is through lots of hard-won experience, is that if I want to get people on the side of using their gardening skills and their gardening enthusiasm to make a difference, I can't undermine those skills or enthusiasm by telling them that what they love and have done in the past is wrong. All I can say is this is what we are seeing. Here are maybe some other choices that might do some of the same things. But if you have a Kousa dogwood in your front yard that you planted, or maybe you bought the house because it was there and you love it, don't learn to hate the Kousa dogwood. Just have a rational approach to it. And maybe don't go plant 500 of them at the edge of a native, an old growth forest. But let's take this sort of kind of gradually, because of all the problems that are out there, invasive species are a huge problem. We should definitely not be introducing new ones. But in your own garden, you're probably not contributing substantially to the spread of those things. But if you are applying fertilizers wantonly or herbicides or pesticides wantonly, you are having an immediate negative impact on the watershed. Does that make sense? It really, again, I truly believe this, is that people love daffodils on Daffodil Hill. Daffodils are not invasive; they don't seed in. They spread very slowly over time, but they're not showing up in the forest. They don't support really any pollinators. When we decided to do the Million Daffodil Project, half of me, and this is the internal strife that I deal with all the time, was like, wouldn't it be interesting to use something else, to teach people that Camassia, to make Camassia the new daffodil. And we are actually interplanting the daffodil in wet spots, in particular with Camassia, which is a native bulb. If you saw the joy on people's faces when they see these fields of daffodils flowering, for me to cheapen that joy or to condemn that joy just feels like the wrong move. Like, use that joy to create a certain amount of energy. It's like, if you think this is beautiful, let me show you the remaining stand of trillium in this little forest here. What can we do to preserve that trillium? To train that perspective rather than reject it. Feels to me like if we want to make positive change at scale, it feels to me like the play. Even with lawns, people love their lawns for a variety of reasons, and lawns are very practical for a variety of reasons. So I would never advocate just to get rid of your lawn and turn it into a meadow, because a meadow is an investment. But start out with changing the way you manage it, maybe carving out pieces of it. And then over time, I think if you do that, you're making positive change as you're doing it. And I think maybe people will become more excited about what they're seeing around their yards and gardens.
Okay, we have time for a really, really quick one. And before we go to our last question, I invite you all to visit the table here. Elm Street Books is in the house with Todd's book. Todd will be signing and personalizing books, and you're welcome to approach him at the table if you have another question for him.
But only if you buy 3 books. I only answer additional questions. It's a minimum of 3 books per question.
Okay,
Yeah.
last question.
My question is, in creating your own garden, and you go to Ace Hardware or something, what sort of basically plant food, soil, and fertilizer should you be looking for so that you make the right choice? And the second question is, I'm concerned about water shortages.
Yeah.
People overwatering their garden, and I'm wondering what can be done about that.
Yeah, so I have a garden in Ridgefield. It is an embarrassing garden that I would never let any of you come visit, but it's a garden that I built over time, and then I have 3 kids and a demanding career and all that. I look forward to a time where I can tend my garden. I have never applied fertilizer. The only time I water is when I plant a new plant. I water it for its first year if I remember. I have a little vegetable garden. I add compost, bag compost to the vegetable garden. I have never sprayed anything, not so much as a drop of Roundup. Maybe a little safer soap to deal with Japanese beetles one year, and that was completely ineffective. So you can have a garden without any inputs. You know, understanding, and it's a journey of expanding your perspective. The first thing I would suggest to anybody who's going to build a garden is actually understand right now what's in that space. Learn the names of the plants. Start to observe the insects that are buzzing around and about. Learn the names of those insects. If you start off understanding what's there, then you can make a slow, gradual process to transforming it from what it is to what you imagine it will be. And through that process, I think your taste will change. I think your idea of what success is will change. And then you are in the process of garden making. This will sound, well, I'll let you judge what this sounds like. So, said garden, I built a stone wall. You live in Connecticut, you should build a stone wall. I did all these things. I had these grand plans, and then just time ran out. And so I have more or less abandoned my garden. And I have a wife, a partner, who's like, I'm married to the head of horticulture at the York Botanical Garden, and our garden is an absolute mess. This is embarrassing. I said, well, that's your problem. I've got a 250-acre garden that I deal with all the time. It's just like it ever is. If you want to fix it, be my guest. And we're still in that conversation, and I feel like I'm going to lose it eventually, but I'm holding on as well as I can. But one thing I did say to Allison is that, one of the mistakes that people make is they think of a garden as a product. They imagine the garden complete and having a martini as the sun sets, and there are no mosquitoes. It's just fireflies. But a garden is not a product. The NYBG is a product that we put on for you guys. So our garden is a product. But one's own garden should be a process. And you're only going to get joy out of gardening if you understand your garden as a process rather than a product. And I really do believe that. And the process should be built on the enthusiasm that we all get of learning the names of the things around us. And you go from there, you're going to be in good shape.
That's a great place to leave it. Thank you so much, Todd. And thank you all for coming tonight.